The hum of the radio was the only sound left in the apartment. John lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his eyes bloodshot, wide open, his body aching with fatigue but unwilling to surrender to sleep. He hadn't slept properly in weeks, and the insomnia had sunk its claws deep into him. Restless nights, anxious thoughts, and a constant undercurrent of exhaustion gnawing at his mind. His tiny one-bedroom apartment felt like a prison, each sleepless hour stretching the walls closer and closer until they pressed in on him, suffocating him. He had tried everything: sleeping pills, meditation, white noise apps. None of it worked. That's when he found the old transistor radio. It had been sitting in a box in the corner of his closet, something he had inherited from his late father but never bothered to unpack. It was ancient, wooden casing, large dials, the fabric speaker cover worn and frayed around the edges. He had taken it out as a last resort, thinking maybe the soft hum of static would help lull him into sleep, the way rain did when it tapped against his window on stormy nights. The static wasn't soothing, but it was something. Now, every night, John would twist the dial between the stations, letting the crackling fuzz fill the room, pushing the silence away. It didn't help him sleep, but at least it kept the quiet at bay. He closed his eyes and let the noise wash over him, thinking for a moment that tonight might be the night he would finally get some rest. That's when he heard it. Beneath the hiss and crackle of the static, faint but unmistakable, a voice, just a whisper. John's eyes snapped open. He listened hard, turning his head slightly to better catch the sound. The voice was so soft it barely registered at first, like someone whispering from the other side of a wall. He sat up, straining to make out the words. John. His heart skipped a beat. It wasn't a clear voice, nothing more than an echo, really, a thread of sound buried deep within the static. He leaned closer to the radio, his pulse quickening. Don't you want to sleep? A chill raced up his spine. He twisted the dial, trying to find the source, but the static only grew louder, fuzzier. The voice was gone. John shook his head and laughed, though the sound came out hollow in the empty room. You're hearing things, man. Losing it. But the static still buzzed, sharp and invasive, crawling into his ears, clinging to his thoughts. He turned the radio off, throwing the room into thick silence, and lay back down, heart thudding in his chest. His rational mind told him he'd imagined it, just a trick of sound. But part of him, the part already frayed by weeks of sleeplessness, wasn't so sure. The next night, John tried the radio again. He had spent the day pacing his apartment, unable to focus on anything. His brain was sluggish, constantly drifting toward the memory of the voice. He couldn't shake it, like it had buried itself inside him, waiting for him to return to the static. When he turned the radio on, the static greeted him, familiar now, like an old friend, comforting and unsettling all at once. He sat on the edge of his bed, listening. Minutes passed, the room filled with the crackling hum, and for a moment it almost felt peaceful. His body relaxed, his eyes grew heavy. Maybe the voice had been a hallucination. Maybe, finally, he could sleep. But just as he was drifting off, the whisper came again. John. He jolted upright. It was clearer this time, closer, like the voice was right next to him. He swallowed hard and leaned toward the radio, his hand trembling as he turned the dial ever so slightly. Why won't you sleep? It wasn't just the voice that made his skin crawl. It was the way it spoke. Soft, intimate, like it knew him. Like it was concerned, gentle. A mother's voice urging him to rest, to stop fighting, to give in. But there was something underneath that sweetness, a tension in the tone that made John's chest tighten with unease. Who's there? He whispered, his voice barely audible over the static. The voice didn't respond. The radio buzzed louder, filling the air with a sharp, grating hiss. John stared at the dials, his mind spinning. He could feel the static wrapping around him, pressing in like a weight, and in that moment he had the irrational sense that something was on the other side of the radio, listening, watching him. He snapped the radio off and pushed it away, his hands shaking. By the third night, John was on edge. The voice haunted him throughout the day. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard it, faint but persistent, tugging at the corners of his mind. He couldn't concentrate on work, couldn't eat. All he could think about was the radio, the static, the voice, the strange sense that it wasn't just sound. It was alive somehow, crawling through the frequencies, searching for him. He resisted turning the radio on that night, sitting in the dark apartment, staring at it from across the room. But the silence was worse. The quiet in the apartment seemed to grow, expanding, pushing against his skull until it felt like his brain was going to crack open. The static was better. At least with the static, he wasn't alone. John caved and switched the radio back on. The static filled the room immediately, louder than before, buzzing with energy like a swarm of insects. John leaned closer, his breath shallow. He could feel it this time, feel the presence behind the noise, lurking just out of reach. John. His breath hitched in his throat. You're so tired. The voice was clearer now, no longer buried beneath the static. It was warm, soothing, almost a lover's whisper. But there was an edge to it, a subtle undercurrent of something cold, something sharp, like a blade hidden beneath silk. Who are you? John asked, his voice hoarse. The static crackled, and for a moment the voice seemed to laugh, soft, breathy, as if amused by the question. Let go. John shivered, his skin prickling with fear. The air in the room felt thick, oppressive, as though something was pressing down on him from all sides. He couldn't explain it, but he felt trapped, like the radio was sucking the air out of the room, drawing him closer. Just tell me who you are, he demanded, his voice rising, desperate. The voice paused. I'm here to help you sleep. John's chest tightened. He could feel the weight of exhaustion pulling him down, but he fought it, his heart racing. The static buzzed louder, filling his head with noise, drowning out his thoughts. You can sleep forever. The words slithered into his mind, wrapping around his thoughts like a noose. His eyelids drooped, his body sagged. The idea of sleep, of endless, uninterrupted rest, was so tempting. He could feel the exhaustion in his bones, the heaviness of it, pulling him under. But then something sharp, something wrong cut through the fog in his brain, and he snapped upright, jerking away from the radio. No, he whispered, shaking his head. This isn't right. The radio hissed louder, angry now, the static buzzing like a swarm of bees. Don't fight it. John reached for the dial, but his hand froze halfway there. His fingers trembled, his chest tight. He could feel it, something behind the voice, pushing against him, pressing against his will. He could feel the radio wanting something from him. With a shout, he yanked the plug from the wall. The static cut off instantly, leaving the room in dead silence. John sat in the dark, gasping for breath, his heart pounding in his ears. The radio sat motionless on the nightstand, the dial frozen mid-spin, the air thick with the remnants of its buzz. But there was no sound, no whispers. It was over. The next day, John woke late, the remnants of the strange encounter clinging to his thoughts like cobwebs. He had finally slept, though fitfully, and his body felt heavy and sore. His mind raced with the memory of the voice, of the way it had crept into his thoughts, whispering promises of sleep that somehow felt more like a threat. He avoided the radio, leaving it unplugged and buried beneath a pile of clothes in the corner. Maybe that was the answer. If he didn't touch it, didn't listen to it, the voice would go away. But even as he moved through his morning routine, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. The apartment felt different, heavier, as though the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for him to make a move. The radio didn't buzz that night. He didn't plug it in. But John still couldn't sleep. The silence pressed against him, thick and suffocating. His mind spun with thoughts he couldn't control, memories bleeding together, images flashing before his eyes. He tossed and turned, but the bed felt wrong. The apartment felt wrong. Everything felt off. It wasn't until the middle of the night that he heard it again. The static. At first he thought it was a dream, a distant, crackling sound so faint it could have been the hum of the city outside his window. But as it grew louder, sharper, he realized it was real. The radio. But it was still unplugged. John sat up in bed, his heart racing. The static buzzed from across the room, louder now, filling the apartment with its invasive hiss. And then the voice came again. John? His blood ran cold. The radio was off, unplugged, but the voice was clearer than ever, whispering from the dark. You're so close to peace. John stumbled out of bed, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The voice was everywhere now, echoing off the walls, filling his head. His vision blurred and the room seemed to warp, the walls bending inward, the floor tilting beneath his feet. Don't you want to rest? He screamed and grabbed the radio, slamming it against the wall. The casing cracked, but the static didn't stop. It buzzed, louder, deafening, filling every corner of his mind. With a final desperate cry, John hurled the radio out the window, watching as it shattered on the street below. The static cut off. And then, silence. For the first time in weeks, John felt calm. The apartment was quiet, the air still. He had destroyed the radio. He had won. He could finally sleep. John lay down in bed, his body relaxing for the first time in what felt like forever. His muscles unclenched, his mind settled, and he let out a long, relieved sigh. But just as he closed his eyes, he heard it, the soft hum of static. John. The whisper was inside his head now.